The room fell silent as Amara stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding like a war drum. She wasn't just here to solve a math problem, she was here to expose a truth buried for decades. Across the room, her professors watched with cold, calculating eyes, waiting for her to fail. But what they didn't know was that Amara wasn't just fighting for herself. She was about to shake the very foundation of academia. What happened next will make you stunned. Before continuing this amazing story, let us know where you're watching from. If you like this story, subscribe to the channel for daily upcoming stories notification. Let's move on to the story. Amara Carter woke up to the soft hum of her alarm, the numbers glowing 5:30 a.m. in the darkness of her small apartment. The heater rattled in protest against the early winter cold, struggling to keep the place warm. She rubbed her eyes and sat up, pushing away the heavy blanket. Her apartment wasn't much, just a one-bedroom space a few blocks from Princeton University, where she was one of the youngest graduate students in the mathematics program. The walls were mostly bare, except for a single frame picture on her desk, a black and white photo of her grandmother, Dr. Evelyn Carter, sitting in front of a chalkboard covered in complex equations. Evelyn Carter had been a mathematical prodigy, but history had not been kind to black women in academia. Despite her brilliance, she had been overlooked, her research buried under the names of white male scholars who took credit for her ideas. Amara had grown up hearing her mother talk about Evelyn's unrecognized genius, and now, standing at the threshold of her own academic career, she felt the weight of that legacy. She stretched, rolling her shoulders, then sat cross-legged on the floor to meditate, something she had picked up as a way to manage stress. Breathe in, hold, breathe out. Mathematics had always been her escape, a place where logic and truth reigned over bias and politics. After a few minutes, she grabbed her worn-out notebook from the nightstand and scribbled down a few thoughts, an idea she had been mulling over about prime number distributions. The Riemann hypothesis, one of the greatest unsolved problems in mathematics, was an obsession of hers, and she felt closer to understanding it every day. By 6:15 a.m., Amara was dressed in her usual outfit, jeans, sneakers, and a thick red hoodie, one of her favorites. It had belonged to her grandmother, a relic from Evelyn's time as a professor at a small, underfunded black college. Stepping outside, the cold air bit at her cheeks. She popped in her earbuds and hit play on a podcast about mathematical history as she walked toward campus. The streets were still quiet, a few early joggers and coffee shop workers starting their day. Amara had always preferred walking to taking the bus. It gave her time to think, to observe. As she approached the university gates, she noticed a familiar sight: groups of students in expensive coats, laughing as they walked together, their privilege as obvious as their designer backpacks. She was used to the looks, the questioning glances that seemed to ask, "What is she doing here?" Princeton's graduate mathematics program had only a handful of black students, and Amara was the youngest. Some professors treated her like an anomaly, while others, like Dr. Whitaker and Dr. Langston, seemed to believe she didn't belong at all. She clenched her fists inside her hoodie pocket and quickened her pace. Amara stepped into Fine Hall, the home of Princeton's mathematics department. It smelled of chalk dust and old books, a scent that had always felt comforting to her. She walked past the graduate student lounge, where a group of third-year PhD students sat in a circle, sipping coffee. "Morning, Amara," said Jared, one of the few students who actually treated her with respect. He was a white guy from Ohio, smart but not arrogant like some of the others. "Morning," she replied, offering a small smile before heading toward her desk in the graduate study room. She set down her bag and pulled out her notes, flipping through them with a sigh. Today was going to be a long day. By 9 a.m., Amara was sitting in Dr. Whitaker's Advanced Number Theory seminar, surrounded by students who either ignored her or treated her as a curiosity. Dr. Whitaker, a severe-looking woman in her late 50s with short silver hair and piercing blue eyes, walked into the room, adjusting her black blazer as she set down her notes. She had been a leading mathematician for decades, and while she was respected, she was also known for her intolerance toward students she deemed unworthy. "Good morning, class," she said coolly, scanning the room. Her gaze barely lingered on Amara before moving on to the students she considered promising. Amara kept her face neutral. She had learned early on that students like her weren't expected to shine in a place like this. As the lecture began, she took careful notes, staying focused. But she knew this university wasn't just about intelligence, it was about survival. As the day went on, Amara buried herself in her work. But the unease lingered. She could feel it. Something was coming. She had spent her whole life proving she belonged in the world of mathematics. But soon she would have to prove it all over again, in the most public, humiliating way possible. By the time Amara stepped into Dr. Whitaker's advanced number theory seminar, the air was thick with unspoken hierarchies. The classroom, a spacious hall with towering blackboards covered in chalked equations, was filled with students, mostly white men, with a few Asian students sprinkled in. The unspoken rule in this room was simple. If you weren't already respected, you had to prove yourself 10 times over. Amara took her usual seat in the third row, setting her notebook on the desk. She was used to the subtle glances, the hesitant way her classmates sometimes responded to her ideas, as if waiting for Dr. Whitaker or Dr. Langston to confirm whether she deserved to be heard. Dr. Whitaker stood at the front, her cold blue eyes scanning the room. Next to her was Dr. Langston, a man in his 60s with graying hair and a smug expression that rarely changed. He had built his career on dismissing students he deemed unremarkable. Today, Dr. Whitaker announced, we will analyze a theorem related to the Riemann hypothesis. Amara's heart skipped. She had been obsessed with this problem for years, inspired by her grandmother's unfinished work. Dr. Whitaker turned to the board and scrawled out a series of equations. Who among you, she asked, turning back to the class, can walk us through a proof? A few hands went up. Jared, sitting near the front, hesitated before speaking. I think the function you wrote assumes the non-trivial zeros are already known. Dr. Whitaker nodded. You're close, but incorrect. A few students murmured. The silence stretched. Then Amara raised her hand. Dr. Whitaker's gaze flickered over to her. She hesitated, her expression unreadable. Yes, Amara. Amara stood, smoothing down her red hoodie. She walked to the board, gripping a piece of chalk. Taking a deep breath, she started explaining. Her voice was steady, her logic sharp. She spoke about zero distributions, functional equations, and prime number behavior, referencing ideas from her grandmother's unpublished research. By the time she finished, the classroom was silent. She turned to face Dr. Whitaker. The professor's lips pressed into a thin line. That, Dr. Whitaker said, her voice laced with condescension, was interesting. Amara felt a chill. Dr. Langston, leaning back against the podium, smirked. Miss Carter, he said, I must ask, where exactly did you find this proof? Amara frowned. I worked through it myself. Dr. Whitaker folded her arms. Are you suggesting you independently arrived at a near-published level proof? That would be remarkable, almost unbelievable. A few students chuckled. Amara clenched her fists. You're saying I didn't do this myself? She asked, keeping her voice even. Dr. Whitaker sighed. Let's be realistic, Amara. These kinds of mathematical breakthroughs take years. Scholars devote decades to understanding these theorems. Forgive me if I find it difficult to believe that a first-year graduate student, with no published work, somehow arrived at a solution on her own. The words stung more than Amara expected. She felt every eye in the room on her, some watching in discomfort, others smirking at her humiliation. But if you insist, Dr. Whitaker continued, perhaps you'd be willing to submit this for review. We'll see whether it holds up. The tone was unmistakable. She wasn't inviting her to submit, she was daring her. Amara swallowed hard, her grip on the chalk tightening. She had walked into this room as a mathematician. Now she was being treated like a fraud. After class, Amara stormed out, shoving her notebook into her bag. Jared caught up with her in the hallway. Hey, he said, voice low. That was unfair. Amara let out a bitter laugh. Unfair? That was an execution. Jared hesitated. Dr. Whitaker, she's hard on everyone. Amara stopped walking and turned to him. No, Jared, She's hard on me. He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it, guilt flashing across his face. Amara shook her head and kept walking. She had one option now. She had to prove them all wrong, and she had to do it on the biggest stage possible. That evening, Amara sat on the edge of her small bed, staring at her phone. Her room was dimly lit, a single desk lamp casting a soft glow over her open notebooks. Her mind raced with Dr. Whitaker's accusations. Plagiarized? Unbelievable? She had spent years pushing herself beyond every expectation. And now, with one stroke of arrogance, her professors had dismissed her entirely. Her thumb hovered over her mother's contact. She hesitated. Calling her mom always made her feel like a child again, like she needed comfort when she should be handling things on her own. But tonight she dialed. The phone rang twice before her mother's warm voice answered. "Amara, sweetheart, how was class today?" For a second, Amara couldn't speak. Then her voice broke. "They think I cheated." A pause, then a sharp inhale. Who? Who said that to you?" Amara swallowed, trying to steady herself. "Dr. Whitaker. Dr. Langston. They think I—" She exhaled. "They don't think I belong." Her mother's silence was heavy. When she spoke again, her voice was low and firm. "Baby, it's time you knew the truth." Amara frowned. "What truth?" Her mother sighed. "I wasn't sure when to tell you, but it's time. Your grandmother, Evelyn Carter, wasn't just any mathematician. She was brilliant, Amara. A genius." Amara sat up straighter. "What?" "She worked on the Riemann hypothesis, just like you. But back then, no one would take her seriously. They stole her work, erased her name, pretended she never existed. The papers she submitted, rejected. The ideas she shared, published under someone else's name." Amara's heart pounded. She had always known her grandmother was a mathematician, but she thought Evelyn had worked in obscurity. Just another smart woman whose career faded over time. She had no idea she had been a pioneer. "She wrote everything down," her mother continued. "Before she passed, she gave me her notebooks. I never understood them, but I kept them. And I kept them for you." Amara's hands trembled. "Where are they?" "In the attic," her mother said. "I'll send them first thing tomorrow." Amara gripped her phone, eyes burning with unshed tears. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for Evelyn Carter, the grandmother who had been erased. 2 days later, a heavy package arrived at Amara's doorstep. She tore it open, hands shaking. Inside were 3 worn leather journals, filled with delicate, precise handwriting. Flipping through, she saw pages upon pages of equations, notations she recognized instantly. Riemann hypothesis, prime number distributions, zeros. Her grandmother had been so close. Amara ran her fingers over the pages, heart racing. This wasn't just a family heirloom. This was a torch, passed down through generations. Dr. Whitaker and Dr. Langston had mocked her, had dared to question whether she had the talent to solve this problem. Now she had proof. Her grandmother had been right, and Amara would finish what she started. Late nights and setbacks. For the next several weeks, Amara barely slept. By day, she attended her classes and sat through Dr. Whitaker's cold stares and Dr. Langston's dismissive smirks. By night, she pored over her grandmother's notebooks, cross-referencing the ideas with modern research. Her dorm became a battlefield of scattered papers, notebooks, and empty coffee cups. But no matter how hard she worked, she kept hitting walls. Some of the notations in Evelyn's journals were different from anything she had seen before. It was as if her grandmother had created an entirely new way to approach the problem, one that modern mathematicians had overlooked. But she was missing something. She would get close, feel the answer just beyond her reach. But then, nothing. Failure. Again and again. One night at 3 a.m., she slammed her notebook shut and buried her face in her hands. What if Dr. Whitaker was right? What if she was wasting her time? What if she wasn't meant for this? Her thoughts spiraled, dragging her deeper into self-doubt. That's when a voice interrupted her despair. "You're overthinking again." Amara looked up. It was Jordan, one of the only classmates who had ever treated her like an equal. He was a tall, easygoing guy with dark curly hair and sharp brown eyes that always seemed amused. but right now his expression was serious. "How long have you been sitting here?" he asked, nodding toward the piles of notes. Amara sighed. "Too long." Jordan grabbed a chair and sat across from her. "You know, I've never seen someone as obsessed with numbers as you. It's terrifying." She let out a weak laugh. "Yeah, well, obsession doesn't mean success." Jordan leaned forward. "Amara, you're one of the smartest people I've ever met, but you're trying to carry this burden alone. Maybe what you need isn't more hours staring at equations. Maybe you need a fresh perspective." She frowned. "A fresh perspective?" Jordan nodded. "Why don't you show me what you've got?" Amara hesitated, but then she thought of Evelyn, of all the times her grandmother had been ignored, of all the people who had refused to listen. Maybe it was time to let someone in. She reached for her notebook. With Jordan's help, Amara began explaining her grandmother's work. To her surprise, saying it out loud helped. Jordan asked questions that forced her to look at the problem from different angles. At one point, he pointed to a series of numbers in Evelyn's notebook. "This pattern, it looks almost recursive, like a sequence feeding into itself. Have you tried approaching it as a dynamic system instead of a static equation?" Amara froze. She hadn't. Her mind raced as she grabbed a pen, flipping to a blank page. Her hand flew over the paper, rewriting her grandmother's equations in a new format. And then, her breath hitched. Something clicked. For the first time, she saw it. The missing connection. Her heart pounded in her chest. She was close. So close. But she needed more time. She needed to push further. And she needed to prove it to the world. The next day, Amara did something reckless. She walked straight into Dr. Patel's office. Dr. Patel was one of the younger professors in the department, an Indian mathematician with a reputation for encouraging new, unconventional ideas. She wasn't as powerful as Dr. Whitaker or Dr. Langston, but she was respected. And more importantly, she hadn't dismissed Amara outright. Dr. Patel looked up from her laptop, surprised. "Amara, everything okay?" Amara took a deep breath. "I need to show you something," she said, placing her grandmother's notebook on the desk. Dr. Patel's brows furrowed as she flipped through the pages. Slowly, her expression shifted from curiosity to shock. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. Amara squared her shoulders. "It belonged to my grandmother, Dr. Evelyn Carter." Dr. Patel's eyes widened. Amara clenched her fists. "I think I found something new," she said, voice steady. "And I want a chance to prove it." Dr. Patel looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Show me." Dr. Patel leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples as she processed what she had just read. Amara sat across from her, heart pounding, waiting for her response. Finally, Dr. Patel looked up. This is incredible," she said, shaking her head in disbelief. "If what you're proposing holds up, it could change everything." Amara swallowed hard. "Then let me prove it." Dr. Patel hesitated. "You know what this means, right? If you present this at the annual mathematics conference, you're putting yourself on a stage in front of the best minds in the world, including Dr. Whitaker and Dr. Langston. They'll challenge you. They'll do everything they can to discredit you." "I know," Amara said firmly, "but I'm ready." Dr. Patel studied her for a moment before nodding. "All right, I'll pull some strings and get you on the speaker list, but you'll need to be flawless." "I will be," Amara promised. The annual mathematics conference was one of the most prestigious academic gatherings in the world. Scholars from across the globe came to present their research, discuss breakthroughs, and challenge each other's work. Amara had never attended before, and now she was about to take center stage. As she stood in the main hall, nerves twisted in her stomach. She glanced around at the crowd, hundreds of professors, researchers, and graduate students, all dressed in formal academic attire. At the front of the room sat Dr. Whitaker and Dr. Langston, their expressions unreadable, but she could feel their doubt, their dismissal, before she even spoke a word. Dr. Patel squeezed Amara's shoulder. "You got this," she whispered. Amara took a deep breath, then stepped up to the podium. The projector screen behind her displayed the title of her presentation, A Novel Approach to the Riemann Hypothesis, revisiting the work of Dr. Evelyn Carter. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Amara cleared her throat. My name is Amara Carter, and today I will be presenting an alternative approach to one of the most famous unsolved problems in mathematics. An approach that builds upon the forgotten work of my grandmother, Dr. Evelyn Carter. The room fell silent. She could feel the skepticism, the disbelief, but she ignored it. She dived into the heart of her research, explaining how Evelyn's work had been overlooked, how her methods had been years ahead of their time. Then she showed her own additions, the missing piece that Evelyn had been searching for. She wrote the final equation on the board and stepped back. Silence. Then, a slow, deliberate clap. Amara turned toward the sound. It was Dr. Patel. Then another clap, and another, until half the room was applauding, but not everyone was impressed. Dr. Whitaker stood abruptly. This is preposterous, he snapped. You're suggesting that a woman whose name is barely recorded in mathematical history was on the verge of solving one of the greatest problems of our time? And that you, an unproven graduate student, just happened to finish her work? A wave of unease passed through the audience. Amara met his glare head-on. Yes, she said simply. Dr. Whitaker scoffed. Unbelievable. I'd like to see your proofs scrutinized by real mathematicians before anyone takes this seriously. Then a new voice rang out. I'd be happy to review her work. Everyone turned. It was Dr. Michael Saunders, a world-renowned mathematician who had spent decades studying the Riemann hypothesis. Dr. Saunders walked up to the whiteboard, studying Amara's equations. Minutes passed in tense silence. Then he turned back to the audience. This is remarkable, he said slowly. She may not have solved the Riemann hypothesis entirely, but her approach presents a genuine breakthrough. A gasp spread through the crowd. Dr. Whitaker's face turned red. That's absurd, Dr. Saunders cut him off. It's brilliant, and it deserves recognition. Dr. Whitaker had no response, because for the first time his authority meant nothing. Amara had proven herself, and the world had seen it. After the presentation, people flocked to Amara, students, professors, even journalists, eager to learn more. Dr. Patel beamed. I told you, she said. Flawless. Amara smiled, still overwhelmed. I couldn't have done it without you. Later that night, she sat alone in her dorm room, staring at a photograph of her grandmother. She placed a copy of her published paper beside it. We did it, Grandma, she whispered. They'll never ignore you again. A week after the conference, Amara sat in Dr. Patel's office, still adjusting to the whirlwind of events. Her breakthrough had made headlines in academic circles. She had received emails from mathematicians all over the world, some congratulating her, some questioning her, and some requesting to collaborate. More importantly, her grandmother's name, Dr. Evelyn Carter, was finally being recognized. The university had announced that they were reviewing Evelyn's old research, and some historians were even pushing to have her work formally acknowledged. It was everything Amara had hoped for, but the battle wasn't over. Dr. Patel sipped her tea. You know, this is just the beginning, right? Amara smirked. I figured. Dr. Patel leaned forward. So, what's next for you? Amara took a deep breath. I want to build on this, she said. Keep working on my grandmother's theories. And, she hesitated, I want to make sure no one else gets erased the way she did. Dr. Patel smiled. Then you'll need a platform. She reached into her desk and pulled out an official-looking letter. Amara frowned, taking it. As she read the first few lines, her eyes widened. It was an invitation to publish her findings in one of the most prestigious mathematics journals in the world. She looked up, stunned. This is real? Dr. Patel grinned. Very real and very well deserved. Amara's hands trembled. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about Evelyn, about every forgotten mathematician who had been ignored. And now she had the power to change that. Later that evening, as Amara packed up her dorm room, there was a knock at her door. She opened it and froze. Standing there, looking awkward and uncertain, was Dr. Whitaker. Amara's stomach tightened. "What do you want?" she asked, crossing her arms. Dr. Whitaker sighed. He looked older than usual, as if the events of the conference had drained something from him. "I wanted to say, I was wrong," he said finally. Amara blinked. He looked at her, not with condescension, not with pity, but with something almost like guilt. "I let my own biases cloud my judgment," he admitted, "and I let arrogance stop me from seeing what was right in front of me." Amara didn't say anything. Dr. Whitaker hesitated, then cleared his throat. "I don't expect forgiveness, but if you ever need guidance or support, my door's open." Amara studied him. She wasn't sure she trusted him, but she saw something she never thought she'd see: humility. For now, that was enough. She gave a small nod. "Noted." Dr. Whitaker exhaled, gave her one last nod, and walked away. A month later, Amara stood in a quiet cemetery, holding a single white rose. She placed it on her grandmother's grave, next to a framed copy of her published paper. Tears pricked her eyes. "They see you now, Grandma," she whispered, "and they always will." She took a deep breath, wiping her tears. Then, with a heart full of determination, she turned and walked away, toward the future she was about to build. Guys, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this story. Let us know about your thoughts in the comments section. Also, subscribe the channel for daily stories notification.